Hey everyone, Gwen here from Nile, and today I want to show you how to build a multi-tenant SaaS application using Python. So for our tech stack, we're going to use FastAPI to build our REST services. To work with the database, we're going to use SQLAlchemy. The database is of course going to be Nile, which is a serverless Postgres and provides multi-tenant capabilities like tenant isolation and tenant management that we're going to use when building our application. For the example, we're going to build a to-do list application. If you think about what do we need for a to-do list application, we're going to need tenants table because it is a multi-tenant to-do list application. We're going to need users table since each one of those tenants has users and users will create tasks for our to-do list. And then we also need a table to store all those tasks for the to-do list. Let's get into it. Nile already has built-in tables for tenants and for users. So we're going to use those built-in tables, but the one table they don't have yet is my to-do list. So let me create a table for my to-dos. Now that we have the to-do table, the last thing we need to do here in the console is to get a connection string to the database so we can use it in our Python application. So let's do that. Remember that these credentials give access to your database, so keep them somewhere safe. Time to clone the example repository and run the example. Okay, now that we have the example, we need to set the environment. And we do that by copying example environment variables into the real file, and then we'll edit it. We need a database URL, the one you just saved a minute ago. But one small difference, which is that SQLAlchemy requires the URL identifier to be PostgreSQL, unlike any other tool or library that we use. With all this in place, let's run things. Because we are going to install a bunch of dependencies, I'm going to create a Python virtual environment for them to not mess up any other Python things that I have going on with this kind of dependency hell. If you are not used to using virtual environments, highly, highly recommended. And now let's install the requirements. Okay, now I'm going to demonstrate the application with the UI. So I'm going to do an optional step, which is building the UI. Let's do that. Install more dependencies. Okay, now that we have this all built, let's go back to Python and run the web application. Okay, so it says the application is running on port 8000. So let's take a look. Okay, so first thing we do is sign up. And then I create a tenant since it's a multi-tenant application, etc. Okay, and now that we have a tenant, we can start creating tasks. Okay, so we have the first task, and we can have another task, and we can keep on adding more tasks. I just showed myself creating a bunch of tasks in the UI. Let's take a peek at the database. And you can see all the tasks in the tasks table. You can see the tenants in the tenant table. And if I go and take a look at the users, you can also see my user over here. If you're not the UI type, maybe you're a backend engineer, we can also use this with REST. And the way we do that, first of all, we want to log in. This is the user I just used. And the trick here is that I saved the cookie that the server sent me in response. Now you don't have to do that. Your own application can also use auth header, and we are returning the token in the response exactly for that reason. But cookies are so much more convenient. The next thing we do with that user is create yet another tenant, and we have the tenant ID. And for subsequent requests, we're going to send the request with a header telling which tenant we have. So if we want to create a to-do for that tenant, a to-do for the new tenant. So this worked. And then if we also want to list to-dos for the tenant, and we can see the to-do that we just created. We've seen how we build this nice backend that uses Nile database and stores everything there. Let's take a look at how we built it. Okay, so you can see the Python application code here. The first thing we do after a bunch of imports and setup is to create the application with FastAPI and to add a tenant-aware middleware. So this middleware runs before every request, and we need it because it gets essential information for processing the request. So let's take a look at the middleware, and it's honestly very straightforward. We have two context variables. Those are variables that remain intact, unchanged, while the request is processed. So they're getting set in the middleware, and no matter what else runs concurrently, etc., the request that runs immediately after the middleware will see the values that are set here. So they are thread safe, if you know the concept. And we inspect the headers, and then we pull out the tenant ID, and if it exists, we set it in context. Similar thing, if we have a cookie and it has a user ID, we do some light validation of the token. We make sure that it actually parses as a JWT token, that the signature is valid, that the expiration date has not yet been expired. And if things worked out, we are setting the user in the context as well. Okay, so the interesting thing is what runs after the middleware. When it comes to processing requests, we have two types of requests. We have requests that we want to send to the tenant virtual database. The tenant virtual database is a key idea in Nile, which means that Nile isolates every tenant into its own virtual database. You can hear me talking about tenant virtual databases and tenant isolation for 10 straight minutes on another video. But for now, imagine that each tenant has their very own database that behaves just like a normal database, but only has data for that specific tenant. For implementing queries like list all to-dos, you want to send them to the virtual database of the current tenant, which is why we extracted the current tenant in the middleware. On the other hand, we have some requests that are generic. They don't apply to a specific tenant. For example, create tenant. It doesn't apply to a specific tenant because guess what? It doesn't exist yet. Or list all tenants. Yes, all those tenants exist. They each have their own virtual database, but we want to list all of them. So we cannot get just connection to just one virtual database. Because we have things that require connection to one virtual database and we have things that require connection that is more global, we have global database context and tenant aware. So let's take a look at the global context first, and then we'll take a look at the tenant context. So for example, when I'm listing tenants, you can see that I'm using the global context. And for that, I'm doing get global session. And this is basically a normal SQLAlchemy connection. Literally nothing interesting there. Getting the connection. And then with this connection, I am running a query. So I get the list of tenants that belong to the current user. This is fairly straightforward. Now let's take a look at the API for listing to-dos, because listing to-dos has to be done in the virtual tenant database of the tenant whose to-dos we are trying to list. So API get to-dos, it's an extremely short function. We're looking at exactly those 3-4 lines. It is now getting a tenant session to the database, so it's a different type of connection. We'll look at that in a second. Once we have this connection to the tenant virtual database, we're running a query, give me all the to-dos. That's it. All we need to do. No workloads, no filters, no joins, nothing. Why? Because we have a connection to the specific tenant database. There are no other to-dos. Nobody else's to-dos are going to be there. So it's very secure and very safe. You can also see that if you do the exact same query in the global session, you're going to get to-dos for all the tenants, which is why we call this an insecure endpoint. And please don't have it in production. This is here for demonstration reasons. So let's take a look at the get tenant session. You can see that we are starting by getting a normal database session. Then we grab the tenant ID and the user ID from the context variables where we previously placed them when we ran the middleware. And then we execute 2 commands on this connection to the database. First we say, direct me to the tenant database. This is the database I want to go to. Nile will route you to the exact specific virtual tenant database. The second command is, and by the way, I'm working as this specific user. And if this user does not have permission to access this tenant database, you're going to get an error. And this is important because you're getting an error, you're not going to get a connection. It will throw, you can see that we do a bunch of clean. It will roll back everything, clean your state up, and you have to return an error to your user saying, okay, sorry, you're trying to do something that you have no permission to do. Assuming that they do have permission, you are now getting a session that is connected as this user to the virtual tenant database. Yield means send it back up so the request will continue processing. And then when the request handler is done processing, in our case, done running a single select and sending the results back to the user, the finally section is going to run. So we're going to reset the user, reset the tenant. The connection is now brand new and clean again, ready for processing the next request. And that's it. This is all you have to do to build tenant-aware application with Python, FastAPI, SQLAlchemy, and Nile. So you're getting from Nile the tenant isolation, you're getting the tenant management, the user management, and of course a serverless Postgres. And what you have to do in your code is introduce this middleware. So you will actually have a tenant ID and the user ID in your context variable when you handle every request. And then implement the get tenant session and tell Nile who is the user and who is the tenant before executing queries. So it will know to run them in the right place. So I hope this has been as fun and educational for you to listen to as it was for me to build. I hope you're going to now go clone this example, try the ideas, build your own SaaS application, doing something a bit more interesting than to-do list. If you build a cool SaaS, you want us to celebrate it with you, or the reverse, you got all confused and you have a bunch of questions and you need some assistance, don't hesitate to join Nile's Discord. We're there, happy to answer all your questions, happy to celebrate your successes with you. We love exciting and successful SaaS applications, so we're looking forward to hear from you.